Greetings, Sentinels fans. When I like a game, I like to translate its mechanics into a story, and Sentinels lends itself very well to this. So I thought it would be fun to have a thematic and mechanical chat about damage and hit points. So let's talk about damage in terms of the game before we talk about it in terms of theming. Don't worry, it won't take too long. Damage, of course, is something every character has to be capable of doing, as there will always be a situation where that character might be the last one standing. Now, not all heroes need to focus on it, but I do feel pretty bad for the person who has to play Dr. Medico all alone, since he has the fewest options for attacks and none of them consistent. As I said in my previous video, it's been my experience that games of Sentinels take around 10 rounds to play, give or take. In the early part of the game, you aren't dealing much damage, but that tends to scale up as your heroes get their setup going. The average amount of hit points across all classic villains is 81 points. For transparency, I did not count the Ennead or the Dreamer because both of them have weird cases with their games. So over the course of 10 rounds, one should probably expect to deal an average of 8 damage per round, which is something that isn't that hard to accomplish. Granted, a lot of villains have additional targets that you will want to take care of, so for safety's sake, let's increase that average to 100 hit points and 10 damage per round, which has led me to a bit of a scale on how useful a turn is in terms of damage. And to be clear, this is a guideline, not a rule. I know every game has its own weirdness. My scale is this: 0 damage, 1 damage, 2 damage, 3 or 4 damage, and 5 or 5 plus damage. If you're doing 0 damage on your turn, then I sincerely hope you are doing something in terms of preparation. Healing people, creating damage boosts, reducing damage, hampering the bad guy, or even just drawing a lot of cards. There isn't a worse feeling than feeling like your turn has been wasted. I see 1 point of damage in a turn as insignificant. It's nice to deal a little ping, but with just 1 damage it isn't really enough progress. So if 1 damage is my only option, then I'll go and set up some more, unless I really need to destroy something. 2 damage is what I consider the bare minimum. You see a lot of character powers that are basically that, deal 2 damage. Or if it isn't an innate power, then it's deal 2 damage and get another benefit on top of that. If you can't do meaningful prep, 2 damage is fine for getting things done. It might be better suited for minor targets than the main bad guy, but it will do in a pinch. 3 and 4 damage are what I ask for at the least when my team is focusing down on damage. And then we have 5+. This is what I consider significant damage. They can be early game put-downs to get rid of threatening targets, or late game gambits, where it takes a lot of setup but deals a huge amount of damage. Damage moments like these are ones that can completely change the board state in your favor. However, the numbers on the scale change a bit for Team Villain games and Oblivion games. For Oblivion games, I put things at 5 damage for damage focusing. Otherwise, any less doesn't really seem worth it. Might as well go for a mission instead. After all, you're given 12 turns, but let's be honest, probably less than 12, to deal 300 damage. And with a few cards to make time move faster, you don't really have time to lose. In Team Villain games, the number changes to deal at least as much damage as the villains are, however much that happens to be. Now before I get to the full theme stuff, some fun observations. Most villains have hit points that end with 0 or 5. However, there are 2 that do not. Apostate has, wait, take a guess. Imagine this whole motif. How many hit points do you think he has? That's right, 66. I feel like the guy himself chose his hit point count. I think the reason that he does not have 666 hit points is because Fnatic took out the first 600 in their first encounter. I'm half convinced his actual hit point count is 66.6, but the game rounds down. The other villain with an abnormal hit point count is Wagermaster at 51, which is a touch annoying because if he had 52 hit points, he'd have a hit point for every card in a deck of cards. Maybe he has a hit point up his sleeve. So the main question, what is damage in the theming of this game? Well, the obvious answer is people beating each other up. But you'll note that if this is the case, then there's some weirdness going on here. First, most heroes have between 20 and 30 hit points. And from the 81 hit point average from earlier, most villains are sitting comfortably at around 2 or 3 times a hero's hit points, even the comparatively normal Baron Blade and Ambuscade. So what gives? Well, everything that goes on in the card game is simply a representation of what's going on in the scene. So what's happening in the scene doesn't have to translate literally. Instead of Legacy punching Baron Blade in the face, he might be forcing his way through a door, or destroying a robot acting as an obstacle. It's things like this that allow me to rationalize some things, like why Baron Blade has fewer hit points on his reverse side when he is in a battle-ready mech suit, or why Ambuscade, a normal man with no defense-oriented powers, has more hit points than Iron Legacy. So damage is more representative of progress being made rather than physically or mentally hitting the enemy. This way of thinking also allows for things like self-damage. As I mentioned in my Evolution of Baron Blade episode, the Vengeance version of him hits himself. This is not him literally punching himself, that would be silly, but represents his body violently rejecting his power-granting concoctions. There's also Legacy's heroic intercession that depicts him putting himself in harm's way and getting beat up in order to protect his team. After that though, most self-damage comes in the form of psychic damage, which fits the broad scope of mental harm, from psionic attack to emotional distress or mental strain from overtaxing one's powers. Now, a few years ago, I saw a conversation where a player tried to quantify how much damage a point of damage is in real-life terms, and the answer came up with was 1 damage equals 1 bullet. And to me, a quiet but kind of cruel observer, I could not help but laugh at the entire conversation. Now, I think I get where the rationale came from. They probably looked at the police backup card, saw one of the police carrying a gun, saw that the card did 1 point of damage per turn, and reasonably assumed that the cop shot Citizen Dawn there. So therefore, 1 gunshot is 1 damage. This idea would be supported by Chrono Ranger's one-shots and base power. This idea is not supported by other evidence in the game, however. Expatriate's pistols each do 2 damage on their own, Stuntman's shots deal variable damage depending on if he's hogging someone else's turn, and other sources of damage seem like they shouldn't be the same as a gunshot. You see, every mechanic in this game is a representation, and the lens we see the scene through is a comic book panel. This comes to a bit of a meta-commentary. Attacks in works of fiction are only about as powerful as the narrative weight given to them. You see this in movies and cartoons, anime and manga, and of course, in comic books. If an attack does not have narrative importance, then even if it does land, it will not be deadly. If the attack is given narrative importance, then it will be more deadly. This is essentially the basis of plot armor. If an attack is not supposed to incapacitate a person, then it will not. So it really is all about presentation. So without other factors, what would be of more narrative importance? A gunshot fired by a no-name cop, or an arrow fired by a main character? Well, more people would care about the major character, so that arrow will have more narrative importance. Another thing to consider, if 1 bullet is 1 damage, then logically speaking, Wraith can take 25 bullets and be okay. Because that's how these things work, right? Also, a quick look at things that deal 1 damage. Wraith throwing a knife, Stuntman shooting you, Chrono Ranger shooting you, Expatriate hitting you with an SMG, Ra standing too close to you, a giant rat mauling you, an even bigger rat mauling you, getting punched by Mr. Fixer, being hit with a stick, being buffeted by a squall, and Visionary thinking really hard at you. I find it difficult to believe that every point of damage in this list is created equal, considering the different ways a point of damage is depicted. Or am I to believe that Stuntman bonking you in the back of the head is equal to Ra blasting you with fire out of annoyance, or being shot with something described as an infinity cannon? And of course, where do damage boosts fit in the equation? I understand getting fired up and hitting harder, or your attacks being physically boosted by another source. But does inspiration make bullets go faster? Does deciding on hurting something make you hit harder? Come to think of it, how does your self-contained boost work? Okay. Well, again, it's all representative. Maybe you become more aware and start hitting an enemy's weak point for massive damage. Maybe you start running on adrenaline. Maybe you just become really lucky. Express your creativity and see what you come up with. I hope you have found this talk interesting. I know a lot of it is just me overthinking things, but that's pretty much what this channel is for. On that note, take care, friends. When I like a game, I like to translate all of its mechanics into pleh. What are you looking at, rabbit? I'm being judged by a rabbit. Sentinels take about 10... Who the heck is honking their horn? Also, a quick look at things that deal 1 damage. Wraith throwing a knife. Shuntman. It's now Shuntman.